Professor Nomi Claire Lazar is a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, where she is also an elected member of the governing board. She is quite an expert on these convoys and the state of emergency that Canada was sent into with the convoys. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Much appreciated.
So, do the convoys still exist? Is this still taking place? Because the media seems to have forgotten about them.
Well, certainly there are still protesters in Ottawa. My daughter and I finally ventured downtown over the weekend, and there's still plenty of people around flying upside down Canadian flags and saying rude, nasty things about Trudeau. And just yesterday, I saw a truck parked with the signature flags as well. So certainly there are protesters still around, but that, of course, is their democratic right. At this point, the protesters are behaving as we expect protesters to behave. They're not committing any offense or disrupting the lives of Ottawa citizens, but they're certainly still around.
So let's just work backwards on when they started to show up at the Capitol. Was there a sense that they were going to do this, or did it just pop up overnight?
Well, we had, as far as I understand, quite a bit of advance notice that they were on their way. And so far, we, the public, don't have that much information as to why the police were not adequately prepared. Is it the case that they simply didn't know what the protesters were planning? There have been suggestions that they did know. But the police have said, or certainly were saying at the time, that they didn't expect this kind of thing. So they knew that there were people coming and planning to protest, but they didn't expect that this occupation style of protest. And the issue really was not so much that the protesters were here, but that they had basically entrenched themselves in such a way that the streets could not, physically could not be cleared. So certainly there were huge failures on the part of the police. It is heartening that there was accountability almost immediately, so that the chief of police resigned. So did the head of the police board, who was not adequately. The board is supposed to be supervising the police, and they were not adequately exercising their power in terms of making sure that the police were doing what they ought to. So the board chair has also resigned. And we do have a process of accountability underway as well with respect to police members of the police force who seem to have been actively supporting the convoy financially and otherwise.
Interesting.
So the good news is accountability. That's what we want to see.
So the police chief resigned and the member of the board, and this was because they did not put preventative measures in place. And that seems that actually, that would never happen in the United States. Let's be real. But that seems almost. That's very aggressive. Was there anything else? Like, were they linked financially, those people in particular?
No, not so there have been 2 or 3 members of the Ottawa police who have been linked financially. They're just regular members of the police, and they are being held to account now. They're being investigated now. But the resignations were less over a lack of preparedness than a lack of action afterward. So the citizens of Ottawa were very disturbed. We're quite I'm sure you Americans, think of us Canadians as boring. And if you could think of the most boring
nice. We think of you as nice.
then Ottawa is it's a very, very nerdy city. So it's tech and policy, basically. So it's just wonks all the way through. And we're quite a law-abiding group of folk, and our city's 94% vaccinated, et cetera. So, but we're used to protests, right? It's not as that it is still the capital city, but we were not used to. I can't think of another situation in which we had ever seen a protest quite like this, where the public were the target. And so that, I think, was very shocking to people, and the police seemed not to be doing anything. And again, we don't know what the background is there. The chief of police kept saying we're trying to avoid provoking violence, which is, if they had just been here for the weekend, might have made sense. Like, okay, let them be raucous for a couple of days, then they'll leave. The key thing is let's not spark some kind of violent altercation where people are actually going to get hurt. So if it had just been the weekend, that might have been fine, but then it dragged on week after week, and the police were just sort of standing there, not enforcing the law, not protecting people. And that was really, really shocking to the citizens, this sense of suddenly being completely vulnerable to a breakdown in public order, not being able to have faith in the police to protect us, especially once things sort of escalated to, I'm not sure if you heard down there about the arson incident where two men went and started a fire in a residential building and taped the doors of the building shut in the middle of the night. And so people were quite, luckily no one was hurt. The residents, found the fire and put it out. But this was, they believe, in response to the fact that residents of the building had been sort of shouting at the protesters overnight.
Oh,
so
my God.
There was a lot of fear, and the police were just not there. And so that was the accountability. That was the failure right there. So even if they had not anticipated that the protesters were going to entrench in this way, the failure to protect our sense of safety was really the thing that the citizens of this city were wanted to see the police held accountable.
So you said something a couple minutes ago about how they were targeting the public. Why did they go? I think the question we don't understand here is, go to Ottawa because it's the capital. We're used to associating going to the capital to target lawmakers, or to pressure lawmakers, or because capitals represent the government. But you're saying that they were targeting the public, and then the second question is, where were these truckers coming from? I'm assuming they weren't part of big tech, wonk 94 vaccinated, given especially that it was a protest against vaccinations.
So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that, so the vast majority of the protesters were coming from outside of Ottawa, but the vast majority of truckers are also vaccinated. It's about 90%, right? So we have to be careful. We keep saying the truckers, but of course the truckers are as diverse as everyone else. They're racially diverse. They're gender diverse. My cousin, my female cousin, is a trucker or has been a trucker, and they were overwhelmingly vaccinated. So we do have to be a little bit careful. We keep saying the truckers, but they're a very diverse bunch of people. But most of them were coming from outside the city. That is true. Although there was support from within the city too. And this is one of the areas where this situation becomes quite interesting politically, is that if you look at who within the city of Ottawa were supporting the truckers, it was the yoga studios, for example. So we again see how politics that sort of converge around vaccine issues, that converge around right-wing issues, are not what we expect them to be. They're not falling along the lines of cleavages that we normally expect, whether that's in terms of identity or whether that's in terms of right-left or in terms of class, that there seems to be something new happening here. And that might also help to explain why the Convoy is using this really vague terminology of, freedom, which of course is an endlessly elastic term, because it provides a sort of a touch point where people can converge around an idea. So where you can sort of build solidarity from a group of people who are actually, quite diverse. So of course there are white supremacist leaders, and there are people who are willing to stand next to white supremacists. And then there are people who are there for lots of other reasons as well. And they're all they're building a coalition around this, freedom idea without really explaining what that means. And that's something we have to pay attention to in terms of the way that politics is changing. So there are three things here. One is the prevention issue. The second is the accountability issue. And the third is understanding how politics is changing, and how seeing how this convoy played out may help us understand what's coming.
That's a really important marker. I think we've noticed this, and we've covered this extensively on our show, just the different groups that say, media is a big part of this, social media and like these types of shows that we do now, where it's very decentralized, and you may have, it's like a pipeline. There's a propaganda pipeline out there. You might be somebody who's into the spiritual movement, and into spirituality and yoga, which frankly, I am. And I have a lot of my friends that I've seen online get radicalized because they distrusted the vaccines, they distrust the government, and there's a lot of reason, obviously, to distrust big pharma and the government for doing a lot of horrible things. But it's predatory. The right wing has seen this as an opportunity to prey on different communities and somehow loop them in at whatever their sticking point is, whatever the thing that brings them in. And suddenly, the next thing you know is your yoga instructor is hosting white nationalists that have showed up, via trucks. It's you're right. I think this is a really, really important point that we need to delve into more. It needs to be openly expressed more and considered, because if people don't understand, where this is coming from, they could also fall victim to it. So, in terms of, I mean, it's interesting you say that the truckers who did show up were not from Ottawa. Were there certain regions? Were they being organized in one area and being dispersed and pushed to Ottawa? Or, I guess, where were they being recruited? In the States, we know that there's right-wing media that the trucking community it's easy to listen to these right-wing talk shows on the radio, and left doesn't really have radio in our country. So, there's been a lot of research about how information was being spread, at least in the States. But I'm very curious how that plays out earlier in Canada.
So first of all, I should point out that my main area of expertise is states of emergency. So so I can't speak to specifically to the sort of communication techniques that led up to the convoy. I can say that, first of all, again, we're talking about a tiny minority of truckers. So that needs to be kept in mind. That also, again, if we're sort of looking at these questions of cleavages and, do we see this as a class issue? Do we see this as an urban-rural issue? So certainly there's some focus in the West here. So if you look at two of the main leaders of the convoy movement, Tamara Lich and I think it's King as well, but it might have, I think it's King. But certainly Tamara Lich are sort of associated with this West separatist movement in Canada, which basically is advocating for the Western, all the provinces west of Ontario and the three Northern Territories to secede. Now, just again, to put this into perspective, they got 0.2% of the popular vote and no seats in Parliament. Wow. So this is a really fringe movement. And even with the so Dichter was running, or was associated with the People's Party of Canada, which is sort of the furthest right party, and it also has just a really tiny fraction of support. So it's easy because the trucks are big and right. The media is big, right? To see this as a bigger problem or a bigger, challenge, I shouldn't say, all democratic discussion is important and rich, and we don't want to, say, so we'll call it a challenge rather than a problem. Mm-hmm. But to see this as a bigger challenge than it is, but at the same time, it would be a mistake to minimize it too, because it is, so whatever it is that's sort of drawing people together, this distrust, right? This sense of, not knowing what kind of authority to turn to, which may be the thing that's sort of helping to draw like the yoga community together with white supremacists, that is much more pervasive.
Interesting.
So there was a poll that came out, I think yesterday or the day before in Canada, that showed that just a vast majority of Canadians felt that they were angrier, more upset, more distrustful of each other, less inclined to help each other, and just generally the sense of a loss of trust in institutions, wow. Trust in authority. And that probably was building before the pandemic, but I think was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so this may just be, if we think about the convoy as sort of like one way that this more general worrying phenomenon is bubbling up in a small portion of the population, but that more general phenomenon is something that we, as citizens on both sides of the border, need to engage. Because if you cannot trust authority, That doesn't mean you don't want authority.
Right.
You just cast for some other authority, and heaven knows what. Well, we've seen the sorts of things that can happen next.
It's a very important point. It's like, we see this play out. It's like I think the question is, okay, you don't trust authority because they've failed in the past, and there's a distrust of institutions because they're not performing the way that they were designed in very unstable times. But does that mean that you don't believe in democracy? And these are big questions, I think, that we're all kind of grappling with right now. So Trudeau, though, speaking of democracy, Trudeau stood up very clearly and clamped down on these protests pretty early on. I'm curious, like, how did the Canadian people respond to this? Is this precedented for him to do something like that, or any prime minister to?
Well, that's an excellent question. So Trudeau, as you may know, Trudeau's father was also prime minister a very long time ago. And in 1970, when there was a separatist terrorist movement in Quebec, Trudeau, the first prime minister Trudeau, used the War Measures Act, which was a pretty serious piece of legislation, to call the army out into the streets of Montreal to deal with this terrorist movement that had, murdered politicians and diplomats, and they were blowing up mailboxes, etc. And this, at the time, was a very popular move. So people really supported him. But then the powers were abused. There were mass arrests. The RCMP, who were in charge of exercising those powers, really did abuse their power. And there was an inquiry afterward. And that was why the War Measures Act was scrapped. And as history has, as time has moved on, although Canadians really supported that early on, now it's sort of generally recognized as like a black mark on the reign of the first Prime Minister Trudeau. So we may be seeing the same kind of thing play out again with Trudeau the Younger. So there was a massive support. I think it was something like 70% of Canadians supported the use of the Emergencies Act. And we may want to touch on this question of, okay, people supported it. Okay, it was effective. Does that entail that it was the right thing to do? Because I think those are separate questions. But and I think he made it was a good move that the act was used quickly and effectively, and then the powers were put down quickly. That was important, both morally, but also politically.
And then, quick question on that. What does that mean? Yeah. What does the Emergency Act mean? What happens?
Okay. So when we got rid of the War Measures Act, which was really for wartime, during peacetime, the Canadian government, the Justice Department, spent years and years and years very carefully developing this piece of legislation, the Emergencies Act, which sets out 4 different kinds of emergency. So public health, an emergency that might be related to like a natural disaster or that kind of thing, public order emergency, all the way up to a war emergency. And it gears the powers that the government can use to address that emergency very carefully to the seriousness of the situation. So the idea is, instead of this blanket emergency thing where like there's an emergency, you can do whatever, which is what a lot of states emergency legislation says. It says here are the things you can do, and only these things in this kind of situation. And it builds in all of these checks and balances along the way. So the Prime Minister can ask the Governor General to declare the emergency, but then Parliament has to has to approve it, both the House of Commons and the Senate. And if they don't approve it, it's gone. So it can't be, just unilateral executive power. Then you have the Parliamentary Review Committee, which is just getting up and going now, which examines every single action taken under the Emergencies Act and can also, help scuttle the act as a whole, because only a handful of MPs can call, or members of Parliament can call for another debate in Parliament, which could just get rid of the act. So we have all these checks and balances, all of these safeguards in this Emergencies Act to help prevent the kinds of abuses that we saw with the War Measures Act early on. So Trudeau used it. He was the first one to use it. He used it fast. He gave the powers back. Now we're having the Parliamentary Review Committee. We're going to have an inquiry. And this question, like, okay, it was effective. Okay, people supported it, but was it strictly necessary? This is what we're gonna see next.
Is there a sense, now that there's been at least a beginning of a review, of who was funding this? Was there funding behind this? Obviously, we saw some Facebook groups pop up, and that's happening all over the world. That could be organic. It could also be boosted. But is there any sense?
There was information leading up to the declaration of the Emergencies Act that through the GoFundMe platform and the other funding platforms, that about half the money was coming from the United States. And that was, of course,
individuals or organizations?
I'm not sure exactly. Certainly a lot of individuals. I'm not sure about organizations. So certainly that was a matter for some concern. People did point out that the same thing is true when there are environmental protests in Canada, that a lot of the money supporting those protests also comes globally. And so there were, questions, all the way through. People were saying, okay, are we using a double standard here?
I mean, the implications, let me just interrupt there. If you are drilling in Canada and on Indigenous land, I think that there are more global implications than vice versa. Sorry, just.
And there are global implications for the convoy as well. Yes. And I'm not, so I'm not personally taking a position on whether, whether that's ever appropriate, just that people had raised these kinds of questions with respect to the funding. It might be useful for people to know that all of those funds are still frozen, and there is a class action lawsuit that was launched by citizens of Centretown in Ottawa, and so all those funds that were donated are frozen and are being held in escrow pending the result of that lawsuit. And so all those funds that people donated might end up going to compensate the businesses that lost. Collectively, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars, and the citizens who had to put up with this, relentless, permanent hearing loss, causing noise, etc. So that money is now frozen in escrow, pending the hearing on this lawsuit.
And where were they saying the money was going to go, anyways? I mean, what did it gas or was it paying people?
So my understanding, and again, this is not my areas of expertise, was that it was meant to compensate truckers for the cost of food and the cost of fuel. And, they had set up this whole carnival. There was a bouncy castle. There was a hot tub. They were setting up, food stalls, and right across from my office in the public park, they'd basically taken the whole thing over and set up all of these festival type things. So my understanding was that was what the money was for. We do know that Tamara Litch, for example, had $1.3 million that she had taken from this fund in her personal account. That's also been frozen in escrow. She handed that over. It's been frozen in escrow pending the result of these lawsuits. It's also worth noting that under both the provincial state of emergency and the national, I believe also the national one, but certainly under the provincial state of emergency, the organizers can be held liable for the costs of resolving an emergency that they cause. So these tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars and then of course that hundreds of millions of dollars in losses from the from blocking the border could end up being a liability for the organizers.
Was anybody hurt? You mentioned hearing loss, but were there any other sorts of physical? Was anybody hurt along the way, like confronting them or anything else?
So it's worth noting that the police, once the Emergencies Act came into force and there was this cooperation between the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that is, the Ontario Provincial Police and the local police, and police forces, members of police forces from across Canada who came to help out, that was pretty much, if you're going to have police action in a demonstration situation, extremely well behaved. And as far as we know, someone was very slightly injured. But other than that, a situation which could have become very violent did not. And that's something that hopefully will help restore some faith in our local police. Before that, in terms of altercations with the protesters, I know that the police are currently investigating 400 different incidents that took place. So there was a situation where some convoy members went and tried to get food from the Shepherds of Good Hope, which is a downtown homeless service or service provision center. So you can get clothes, you can get help with finding housing and jobs, etc. And they were told they could not access meals there, and then beat up a person of color, a homeless person of color, and they were shouting slurs at the security guards. They knocked down. So we have a very much beloved little local ice cream shop, and one of the employees was knocked to the ground on his way to work and yelled at for wearing a mask. These are just the situations that I know about personally, but we know there are 400. And then one of my students who was out having a cigarette, luckily he had his dog with him, had some protesters walk by and start yelling homophobic slurs at him and threatening to beat him up. And so he was very, shaken and upset. So certainly there was an air of disorder and violence that was quite unnerving to residents. And again, there were plenty of Convoy members who were peaceful. And we should be glad that this didn't erupt into mass violence, which we were all very worried about. So, this could have been much, much worse. But at the same time, we do need to be aware that there were these, very horrible violent incidents, notably the arson, which really scared people, understandably, and just the sense that of fear walking down the street. We became afraid of our own flag because that became a symbol, right? And so my kid had to cross the police line to get to school. And so just having to brief your young child as she walks to school, like what to do, not to make eye contact, what to do if she sees violence, etc. These were things that certainly in our boring, sleepy little capital were not things we were used to.
And how many days did it go on for?
Sorry?
How many days did it go on for?
It was about 3 weeks.
3 weeks, okay.
Yeah, I think 23 days.
Is there, people have been talking about it a little bit, is there any sense that this may pick up again?
Sorry, I missed that.
Is there any sense that this may pick up again?
I don't think so. In part because, or not in this particular form, in part because the police now, have assured everyone that they are ready to prevent that kind of entrenchment from happening again. Also, the organizers have all been arrested. Some of them have been let out on bail, some not. Their assets are still frozen for the time being. And certainly if we see these like massive financial consequences, so if they're held liable, that's going to make people think twice about the way that they express themselves politically. So again, we want people to express themselves politically. We just don't want them holding the public hostage. You had asked earlier about that, and I don't think I addressed it at the time, that some of the organizers were basically saying, look, people of Ottawa, we're sorry that you're having a rough time, but that's because we want you to tell the Governor General, this is just a massive misunderstanding of how our democracy works, that she needs to throw out the elected government so that we, the Convoy, and together with her, she's the Queen's representative, just together, basically form a new government. So this was truly absurd. But the idea was to sort of pressure us to pressure the Governor General for whatever that's worth. And that really is just that's not acceptable democratic behavior. You don't try to throw out the democratically elected government by torturing the citizens of a capital city. Express yourself, yell, say what you want, but that is just not appropriate democratic behavior.
Where have I heard that before? January 6th. It's unreal. Professor, really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for this update on the Convoy, and hopefully, this won't happen again in any form or rebuild, in any other city in the world right now. Maybe gas prices will affect it, that alone. But it's really an interesting aspect of our unrest right now, and I am sorry that it really had to take a toll on your community in Ottawa, because citizens don't deserve that. So thank you so much for joining us. And from one Nomi to another, I appreciate that.
And just to end on an up note, I don't think that our community has for a long time felt as tightly connected. Yep. Everyone has signs up in their windows that say we love our city. We scrawled we love our neighbors on our window, and so the upside is when you go through something together, it builds solidarity, and that can also be a good thing.
Indeed. And hopefully more good out of it. Professor Nomi Claire Lazar, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
If you're not already, please make sure to support us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we fund the show. Make sure to like and subscribe. We got to get those likes and subscribes up. We've put a lot of thought and effort on what it means to do this show and to be in solidarity with other hosts and what kind of guests we have on. But we're only able to do that because we have patrons.